I'm going to talk about the relationship between doctors, generally some of the institutions or organizations that represent doctors or where they work, and the pharmaceutical industry, and trying to explore what exactly that means for the kind of knowledge that doctors have, and ultimately what kind of care people get, although that's sort of implicit. So just a little bit of disclosure. I have a number of hats that I wear besides the ones that Meta said. There's an organization which is based in Adelaide, Australia, called Healthy Skepticism, that I'm on the management group of. It focuses on primarily drug promotion, so that the messages that the industry tries to send out to doctors, and also what consumers get. I also am involved with some other groups. One of them is called Health Action International, which is an NGO based in Amsterdam that deals with rational use of medications. So a number of things. I've been involved in this area for, I don't know, 35 years or so. So I'm going to cover a number of points in this, and I'm not going to go through this list. You can read it if you want, but we'll touch briefly on all of these issues and how they illustrate the relationship that doctors have with the drug companies. And the main point that I want to make is that there's a difference between what the obligation of drug companies are, and drug companies are like any other enterprise, for profit, and their primary goal is to make money for the shareholders, hopefully without breaking the law, although in the US they've been doing that quite regularly, and in fact over the past 15 years the drug industry has been fined more money for various things than any other industry, including defense. The totals are in the, I think, $15 to $20 billion range in the United States.
Fines?
I'm sorry?
The fines. Fines.
Really? Yes. In both civil fines and also in criminal court. So they do break the law. Even if they don't break the law, though, their goal is the same, which is make more money for their shareholders. This isn't good or bad. This is amoral. Industries have no morals. On the other hand, doctors have a different obligation, and that's to do the best job for patients. And the problem is that oftentimes these two different sets of obligations are not compatible. So we'll talk a bit about that. So here is the front cover of the British Medical Journal, one of the 4 big general medical journals in the world. This is the end of May of 2003. By the way, I'm told, or I just read, this particular cover cost the British Medical Journal a couple of $100,000 in lost advertising. So if we, okay, so the pigs at the table are the doctors. The lizards running around, I believe, are the people from the pharmaceutical companies making sure that the pigs have a good time. And when we talk about promotion, you have to realize that there is enormous amounts of money that are spent by the drug companies on promoting their products to doctors. We have the best data for this from the United States. So here is some numbers that Marc-André Gagnon, was at that point a graduate student. He's now teaching at Carleton. He and I put this together, this table together. So $57.5 billion spent in 1 year, 2004, advertising medications or promoting medications to doctors, well, primarily to doctors. Direct-to-consumer advertising, that's to the public. Those of you who watch American TV will be familiar with the ads that you see there. So that's $4 billion. So really, $53.5 billion spent promoting to doctors. There are about 700,000 doctors in the United States, which means that every year there's about $70,000 spent on promotion for each doctor in the US. The figures in Canada are more difficult to gather, but this is just one rough estimate, $1.3 billion spent here in Canada in 2005. This is probably a low estimate. It might be as high as $4.5 billion. That's just a range, but whatever it is, 1.3 or 4.5, it's still a lot of money. And primarily, money is spent on a number of things. So one of them is detailing. Drug companies have hire people who go from office to office or hospitals to, these are salespeople who speak to doctors. Usually they try and have individual talks or talk on one-on-one with doctors to talk about the products. We'll talk a little later about what goes on in some of these sessions, and samples. Drug companies leave behind samples of their products for doctors to give out to patients, and meetings. This is money that's spent either directly by the drug companies, holding meetings for doctors, oftentimes in the evening at expensive restaurants, or drug companies will also give out grants to people who are putting on conferences and are looking for funding. Okay, so new drugs, when they come on the market, are very heavily promoted. These are figures from Canada from 2000. So Vioxx, this was a painkiller anti-inflammatory medication, came on the market in, I think, in early 2000. Made by Merck, 6 million plus spent promoting this drug in 1 year with over 1,000 pages of medical journal ads, 48,000 visits by sales reps to doctors' offices, and they left behind over 1 million pills in these offices. Celebrex, another anti-inflammatory product, even more sales rep visits. Effexor, antidepressant. Lipitor for cholesterol. Baycol for cholesterol. And the interesting thing, the reason that these stars are there beside these two is that within 4 years, these two products were pulled from the market because of safety reasons. So new drugs come on the market. The drug companies hype them with massive amounts of advertising, but the problem is that some of these products prove to be unsafe and end up having to be removed from the market. So that's this table here. So here we see in any 5-year period, except for this one, in any 5-year period, about of the drugs that are introduced, and that's along here, so roughly about 120, 130 new drugs are introduced per year, or in a 5-year period, and about 3.5 to 4.5% of those products will eventually have to be pulled from the market because of safety reasons. And in fact, half of those drugs that are pulled within 3 or 4 years because of safety problems. And that's because we don't really know an awful lot about how safe new drugs are. They've been tested in relatively small homogeneous populations. But on the other hand, the drug companies are very eager to get their money back on these products, and so they promote them very heavily to doctors, and doctors respond by prescribing them pretty heavily. The other thing, when you're talking about safety, again, because of problems with the numbers of people who are tested, but also because of problems with the way that Health Canada evaluates the data, this is a survival curve which just shows that over time you end up with about 25% of new drugs having a serious safety warning issued by Health Canada for them. So that's 1 in 4 drugs will eventually have a serious safety warning. And I talked briefly about the issue of the way that Health Canada approves drugs, and this differentiates between drugs that are approved through what's called the standard process, which is 300 days. That's the timeline that's supposed to be met, and a priority review process, 180 days. So the rigor of the approval is the same. It's just that for drugs that are considered priorities, in other words, according to Health Canada, drugs that are supposed to represent significant therapeutic advances, or drugs that have use or treatments where there are no existing ones, they get this priority review. But the problem with the priority review is that your chances of having a serious safety problem are much higher if they get a priority review. You're down to, this is about 45% of these drugs will have a serious safety warning issued about them, as opposed to drugs that go through the standard procedure, which is about 25%. So new drugs are inherently unsafe because we don't know enough about them. Priority drugs are even more unsafe. And the reason that Health Canada is doing this fast review has largely to do with the relationship between Health Canada and the pharmaceutical industry in a number of respects, which I have gone into in other publications. Okay, so I mentioned briefly about sales representatives. Here in Canada, the estimate is that there's about 1 sales rep for every 10 doctors, which means that there are probably 7,000 of these women and men roaming around the offices in Canada, talking to doctors, trying to get doctors to use their medications. This is a survey, somewhat old, asking Canadian doctors what they thought of sales reps. And so this is on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is you strongly agree with the statement, 5 is you strongly disagree. So you can see here that if you believe the doctors, they're skeptical of that sales reps are there to educate them. That's a score of 3, so towards the strongly disagree. In other words, they don't agree that education is a major goal. They do agree that promotion is a major goal. They're sort of neutral about whether or not patient benefit is a major goal, neutral about whether or not they get all the information they need from the sales reps, and I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. They don't think that the sales reps give the negative effects fairly, and they're sort of neutral again about whether or not they're affected by what the sales reps have to say. And they certainly would seem to say that they would prefer other methods of getting their information aside from what they get from directly or indirectly from the drug industry. So sales reps are not considered a very good source. CME is continuing medical education. They're sort of neutral about that, but they would clearly prefer to get their continuing education from industry, from literature and peer-reviewed journals, or from talking with their colleagues. Sounds reassuring, but on the other hand, they see the sales reps pretty often. So 1/4 of doctors rarely or never see sales reps, but 3/4 of Canadian doctors do see sales reps. And when you get out here, you're looking at 25%, more than 25% see sales reps almost daily. So 1 sales rep a day. And the question then is, well, if you're seeing these people, what kind of information are you getting from them? Are you getting stuff that's reliable? And the answer, well, if you listen to the drug companies, yes, you are. The organization here, Canada's research-based pharmaceutical companies, this is an organization based in Ottawa that represents primarily the Canadian subsidiaries of multinational brand name drug companies. And they have this code of conduct. And one of the principles in this code of conduct deals with sales representatives, and it says that they must provide full and factual information on products without misrepresentation or exaggeration, accurate and complete, not be misleading either directly or by implication. So a colleague of mine who works out in Vancouver was quite interested in actually looking at what's the nature of these interactions between sales reps and doctors. And she got me involved, and we got money from CIHR, Canadian Institutes for Health Research, and did a study that looked at interactions between doctors and sales reps in 4 cities: Toulouse, France, Sacramento in California, and then Montreal and Vancouver. And we recruited general practitioners from each of these cities who saw sales reps, and then asked them to fill out a survey form after each visit, up to a maximum of 8 visits. And what we were primarily interested in was how much safety information did these sales reps give to doctors. And safety information is particularly important because sales reps promote new drugs. And as I pointed out earlier, we don't know an awful lot about the safety of these new drugs. So here is the start of some information. We'll just look at Montreal and Vancouver. So we wanted to look at 4 different aspects of safety. So non-serious adverse events. So this might be something like you get a rash that goes away, or you feel a little lightheaded for a few days. So non-serious adverse events, less than 1/4 of all of the visits by sales reps did they talk about these non-serious adverse events. Contraindications, reasons not to take the drug, 15%, 13% of the time. Serious adverse events. People end up in hospital. People suffer some kind of consequence that requires additional medical treatment, 6%, 5%, and drug interactions. So does the new drug that they're promoting interact with a drug that somebody already is taking? 2% of the time. So very little safety information is transmitted by these sales representatives to doctors. And remember, 3/4 of doctors see the sales reps. Some of them see them very frequently. On the other hand, if you ask the same group of doctors who didn't get much information around safety, yes, sorry.
But it's interesting to see on that graph there that you know, the only European city that you have there, you know, how much of an amazing increase in, you know, is there to see.
That has to do with the way, with the regulatory situation in France. In France, there is a sales rep charter which the companies have to sign with the, can't remember what the regulatory authority in France is called, but they have to sign this. It's a formal agreement as to what sales reps should or shouldn't do. There's no such agreement here in Canada. Primarily, the visits by the sales reps are regulated by the industry itself, so that, and this is the industry writes the code, polices the code, and sets out the fines for the code. It's different in France. The United States theoretically is different, but in practice, as you can see, not much difference from the Canadian cities.
Can I just ask, so does that mean that in France there's more regulation so that in fact things may be better than in...
Not necessarily. There's also a culture in France where doctors prescribe a lot more drugs than they do in North America. So while the sales reps may be better regulated, that doesn't necessarily translate into better promotion. And in fact, in some aspects of regulation, the French are actually worse off. There was a big scandal in the past few years around a particular drug that had been left on the French market for well over a decade, close to 2 decades, where the evidence clearly showed that it was unsafe, causing significant harm, but it was left, wasn't pulled. And when the scandal finally broke, that led to a reorganization of the entire French drug regulatory system. That happened about 2 years ago. So I wouldn't say that you're better off being a patient in France. Yes?
Sorry, this may be a bit to the side, but why is the concentration on the relationship with the pharmaceutical industry with the medical profession as opposed to the pharmaceutical profession?
Okay, so there are a couple of things here. So first of all, pharmacists dispense drugs and should be giving out information about the drugs that they're dispensing, but they're not the ones responsible for choosing the drugs. Pharmacists, you can ask pharmacists for information about over-the-counter products, and they can help you choose those. But when you present a prescription to the pharmacist, really the pharmacists can do one of 2 things. One is they can ask you whether or not, or they can dispense a brand name or a generic name if the drugs have generic equivalents. Or secondly, if they're concerned about the prescription that's been written, So you always go to Shoppers. Shoppers will have your medical history on, your prescription history on file, and they will look, and they may be concerned that the drug that the doctor is giving you is going to interact with something that you've already got, you're already taking, so they can call the doctor. But they don't choose what medication you're going to take, and the brand name companies do not interact with the pharmacists. It's only the only group that interacts with the pharmacists are the generic companies, and all they're doing is interacting on the basis of price. Generic companies make their money by being the one, it's their brand that the pharmacists choose, so they try and ensure that if there's 5 different generic versions of a drug, that the pharmacist will choose their particular one, and they do that on the basis of price, kickbacks, a variety of things. So the relationship between pharmacists and the pharmaceutical industry is significantly different than the relationship between doctors and the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, so here is the kind of information that the doctors get. But on the other hand, when you ask this is grouping all 4 cities together, but it doesn't matter because if you disaggregate it, it looks basically the same. So 45% of the doctors thought that the information they got was good. 12% thought it was excellent, so more than half were pretty happy with the information. A third said fair, 8% said poor, so you have, and 2% very poor, so you got about 40% there, a little more. But the majority of doctors, despite the fact that they get very little safety information, are pretty happy with what they've been told by the pharmacists. And if you ask doctors, which we did, are you likely to increase your prescribing for the product, or if you're not prescribing it at this point, are you likely to start prescribing it based on the visit you had with the sales reps? Here are the figures. So 63%, almost 2/3, are somewhat or very likely to either increase prescribing or to start prescribing after the visit compared to before the visit. So again, just to emphasize, this is based on getting this quality of information. So despite the fact that, let's go back a bit, doctors don't think much of the motives of the sales reps, would prefer to get information from other places, don't get very good information, they don't recognize it, and they're going to prescribe more. All this, what this indicates is that sales reps, despite what doctors think about them, are pretty effective. And in fact, we investigated, we meaning another group that I was part of, mostly Australians, investigated this with a systematic review where we looked for all of the literature that we could find around quality of prescribing as a result of getting information directly from drug companies. And this got published in something called PLOS Medicine. PLOS is an online journal, open access, a few years ago. And we found 58 studies that met our inclusion criteria, that looked at one or more aspects of prescribing. So we looked at cost. Did the value of did the cost of the prescription change based on the information the doctors got? Did they prescribe more frequently? and how good was the quality of prescribing. In other words, were they prescribing an appropriate drug for the patient's problem, or in some cases, were they not prescribing because that might be the most appropriate response to what the patient was presenting with. And 45 out of these 58 looked either exclusively or partially at visits by sales reps. So this key message, some found poor prescribing on one or more measures. So doctors, the cost of a prescription went up, the frequency of prescribing went up, the quality went down. Some found no change, and none found better prescribing. So sales reps do not make doctors better prescribers. They either have no effect, or they make doctors worse prescribers, and that just goes along with that. All right, so samples. These are the pills that doctors or that sales reps leave behind when they visit doctors. And samples, if we just go far back. Okay, samples. Out of the 57 billion, 16 billion in the US of that amount was from samples. So lots of money is spent leaving behind these free samples for doctors to use. The idea that doctors can get a good idea about how effective drugs are by dispensing samples is a myth. I mean, that's why we have randomized controlled trials. You can't get a good evaluation of the worth of a drug by giving it to a few people. That's anecdotal information which just doesn't cut it. Similarly, the idea that doctors are going to give out the samples to people who need them is also somewhat, who are financially, who can't afford them, is also a bit of a myth. There was a number of years ago at the University Health Network, where I work, that's Toronto General, Toronto Western, Princess Margaret, and now Toronto Rehab Institute. There was a proposal that was going forward to the Medical Advisory Committee. The Medical Advisory Committee is the top group that makes medical decisions for the hospital. There was a proposal that was going forward that said something to the effect that samples that doctors there got should only be used for patients and not for doctors themselves or for their families, and that motion was defeated at the Medical Advisory Committee meeting, presumably because a lot of the doctors on that committee were using samples for themselves or their families or their friends. So just another reminder of the volume of samples that's left behind by sales reps when they visit doctors. Lots, millions or hundreds of thousands, up to millions of pills are left behind for doctors to give out to patients. And just to make another point, new drugs are typically more expensive than older drugs. Most new drugs that drug companies are coming out with now are for chronic diseases, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, respiratory problems, various things, but things that you're going to need to take for long periods of time. So giving out a sample of something that'll last somebody for a week or 2 weeks may be okay if you're giving them an antibiotic and after the end of a week they're finished with their course. But if you're giving them a drug that they're going to be taking for months or years, in the end they're going to be spending a lot more money on that product. Free sample runs out. It seems to be doing its job. It's not causing any serious problems for the patient. The doctor is going to want to stick with that. They're going to write a prescription, but then they're going to be using a more expensive product. So giving out samples to patients in the short term saves a little bit of money. In the long term, costs people a lot more. So what do samples have, what kind of an effect do samples have on the way that doctors prescribe? This is an American study which looked at the cost of a 30-day prescription for medications written in 3 different clinics. And the 3 clinics were one here took samples, and Y and Z did not take samples. And if you look at this here, if you took samples, your overall cost of prescribing was higher than if you didn't take samples. And the reason for that is you get used to using the new drug because you're giving it out, you've got samples. And then when you write a prescription, you're writing a prescription for the same thing. These are more expensive than the older products, so your average cost is going to go up. And when it comes to the quality of prescribing, again, this is an American study. And what they did was they looked at the same clinic in two different scenarios. When the clinic was taking samples and when the clinic stopped taking samples, and they were looking at prescribing of how often did doctors, when they saw somebody with newly diagnosed high blood pressure, how often were they prescribing what was first-line drugs and how often were they prescribing second-line drugs. The first-line drugs were drugs that were available as generics. Nobody promotes generic drugs because you can't make money off of that. The second-line drugs were primarily brand name drugs which were being promoted, and the companies were giving out samples for those. So if you took samples, 62% of the time, the doctors in this clinic were prescribing a second-line drug, and 38% of the time they were prescribing a first-line drug. When they stopped taking samples, these figures basically reversed. So there was a much stronger use of first-line drugs because you didn't have the samples and you weren't used to using those newer, more expensive drugs, and because they were second line, not considered as good, at least not to start with. A little bit of information about samples in Canada, not very much. This is from Quebec. So doctors and residents, people who were in training to be one kind of specialist or another, were asked their opinion about samples and a variety of questions. And you can see here that there was a pretty strong either a large minority or in some cases a strong majority had attitudes that I would not consider to be very good. So enables early assessment of treatment efficacy. Almost half of the doctors and residents agreed that samples did that. You can't do that. You just don't know. You give out 5 people medication, you have no idea. Encourages compliance. In other words, encourages people to take the drugs. Well, I suppose if you're getting something for free, you might take it. More familiarizes staff with new drugs. A lot of them thought that this was a benefit, but in fact, you don't want to, if you're familiar, the more you get acquainted with these products, the more you're likely to use them, but you're using them early on when the safety is still a big issue. Enables some patients to receive drugs that they couldn't afford. In the short term, yes. In the long term, no. But most of the doctors thought that was a good thing for samples. Favors use that may not be first line. So of the doctors who were in independent practice, only 1/3 thought that agreed with this statement. But in fact, if the drug companies were getting only 1/3, they wouldn't be giving out as many samples. And increases patient satisfaction. Presumably this is because people are getting things for free, but you only get them for free for a week or so. So overall, the attitudes of doctors, at least in this particular situation, were not very realistic about samples. Okay, I want to talk a bit about gifts and trips. So this is Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. This is the Hare Krishnas, who used to inhabit the international departure area of LAX. Everybody's familiar with the Hare Krishnas, colorful gowns, wandering around, shaking their tambourines. In the airport, these people would come up to people waiting to leave on a flight and hand them a flower. Now, most people, at least the ones that I've talked to, if they saw the Hare Krishnas coming, they would turn around and try and go the other way. If you were not successful in avoiding them, if you took the flower, chances are that you would, once they had left, you would throw it in the garbage. So you were getting a present that you didn't want from somebody who you didn't like. But what would a large number of people do if they accepted the flower? They paid, they gave money to the Hare Krishnas, $1, something like that. This is an example of what's termed the gift relationship. The gift relationship is very powerful. It operates subconsciously, but it's widely used by the drug companies with respect to doctors. And if you want another example of the power of the gift relationship, you just need to think about Christmas cards. This year, you got a Christmas card from somebody you didn't think was worthwhile sending one to. What are you going to do next year? They're still not worthwhile, but having gotten a gift from those people in the form of a Christmas card, you're going to reciprocate. And that's what the drug companies rely on, this subconscious gift relationship. And this has been investigated in a number of places, including here in Toronto. This is somewhat old, about 20 years ago. What they did was they looked at either medical students, that's the clerks, interns, or residents who were doing psychiatry rotations in a variety of hospitals in Toronto. And they surveyed them about gifts, meals, etc., that they had gotten from the drug companies. So the mean value was $60. A third of them had gone to dinners. A little under half had gotten books. 42% disagreed with the statement that I would maintain the same degree of contact with reps if no gifts were distributed. In other words, a lot of them wouldn't see the reps except for the gifts. And finally, and most interesting, at least to me, was that the more you got from the companies, the more you were sure that you weren't affected. And that is actually a pretty consistent finding. So here we have, this is an American study looking at interns and residents. And what they asked them was, do you think that you are affected personally by seeing a sales rep? 61% said no, 38% said a little, and 1% said a lot. Then they asked them, well, what about the other doctors that you deal with? Do you think that they're affected? And the results are significantly different. 16% said they're not, 51% said a little, and a third said that they're affected quite a bit. So personally, my integrity can't be questioned, but my colleagues are not necessarily as good as me, and they might be. And this is naivety on behalf of the doctors, which again is not justified. People do not realize how much that they are affected by their interactions. And here is just a little anecdote to show that doctors are really affected when they don't think they're going to be. This has to do with the promotion of a new antibiotic at one American hospital. So there were 20 doctors involved, and these doctors, well, let's start here. The drug is added to the hospital formulary. Point number one. And it's being prescribed at the rate of about, 60 or 70 units a month. And there are other antibiotics which are virtually the same. So this new one has no effect, or no additional benefits. It's not more effective, it's not safer. And the prescribing sort of goes up and down a bit, but it generally stays at about, 60, 70 units a month until time two. Time two is when this group of 20 doctors were invited on an all-expense-paid trip to go somewhere in the Caribbean in the middle of winter to hear more about this new antibiotic. And before these, it says, luxurious West Coast resort. Okay. Before these doctors went, they were asked, will the trip affect your prescribing of this new antibiotic? Out of the 20, 19 said no, and 1 said yes. All right. So the invitation arrives, prescribing goes up, but then it goes down when the doctors are at the meeting, and then it goes back up once they come back from the meeting. And although there are dips and fluctuations, if you use a little bit of imagination, it's going to looks like it's leveling out at about 350 units, so 5 times the prescribing as before they went on the trip. So despite what these doctors thought, their prescribing was actually significantly affected, and This just tracks the use of the antibiotic in US hospitals in general. And you can see that it did go up a little bit around the same time, but nowhere near to the degree it went up in this one hospital where these doctors had been flown out. So again, an example of the gift relationship. You got a gift, you're going to repay the gift, even if you don't think you are. This, again, explores the idea of, or the effect of gifts on doctors. And this is a very interesting study. This was looking at residents, and they asked them whether or not they thought they were entitled to gifts from the drug companies and whether these gifts were acceptable. So the control situation is you ask them conflict of interest questions around the acceptability of gifts, and then you ask them two other things. So one is a sacrifice question. Sacrifice means in order to get to your position, you've given up a lot of opportunities, you've spent years doing this job, you've worked nights, you haven't had enough time with your family, you're eating meals rushed. So you've made a lot of sacrifices. And then they suggested rationalization, so reasons why taking gifts would be okay. And at the end of this, in this order, where you ask the questions first and then you talk about sacrifices and rationalizations, only 21% of the people thought that accepting gifts was okay. But if you reverse it, so here, first you talk about sacrifices people have made, then you ask them the conflict of interest questions, and then you suggest rationalization for taking the gifts. All of a sudden, it goes up to 47% think that gifts are acceptable. And finally, if you do sacrifices, then you suggest rationalizations, and then you ask about the conflict of interest, 60% think that gifts are acceptable. So the way that doctors think about whether or not they're entitled to gifts can affect how they answer. And this just again shows that doctors, as anybody else, can rationalize things that they think are morally wrong. All right. Continuing medical education. So again, poor data from Canada, so we're going to look at US data. How much money is being spent on continuing medical education? By the way, continuing medical education is a requirement for doctors, both in Canada and in the US. You have to put in a certain number of hours per year on one or other form of continuing education in order to retain not your license, but your accreditation as either a specialist or as accredited with the College of Family Physicians of Canada. So it applies both to GPs and to specialists. And in the United States, the same thing. So at one point in the US, in the 2006-07, out of the $2.5 billion spent on CME, about half of that money was coming directly from the drug companies. It's dropped a bit now, so it looks like it's about 35% of the money comes directly from the drug companies. And the rest comes from other things, so fees that you pay. By the way, other revenue also includes the booths that the drug companies rent at these meetings. If you ever go to a large medical conference, there is typically a hall which is filled with booths from drug companies with their representatives in the booths giving out little gifts, pens, notepads, other things, and where they are more than happy to talk to you about their drugs. So other revenue includes the amount that the drug companies pay for these booths. So that's indirect money, but direct money, in other words, grants or funding that the industry gives out, about 1/3 of the cost of CME comes from that. Here in Canada, as I said, we don't have a lot of information, but according to the College of Family Physicians of Canada, 70% of all of its continuing education programs had some pharmaceutical money attached to it. And in Canada, in this year, companies spent apparently $340 million on meetings. That's not just continuing medical education, though. So we don't really know exactly how much, but it's substantial amounts of money. So what do we know about what the effects of this is? And even if you assume that the information that's given at the meetings is objective, and there is evidence that it's not, there is still a significant bias when you deal with CME funded by drug companies versus CME that's funded in other ways. So this looks at two different sets of courses that are offered. One through Harvard, where the money comes from fees that people pay to attend, and the other is courses or events sponsored by the drug companies that are for free. And the differences are quite striking. So the number of different topics. So Harvard, compared to the industry, 4 times more topics. And the industry, naturally, concentrates much more heavily on drug therapy than do the courses that are offered by Harvard. So if the more we rely on industry as doctors for our continuing education, the smaller the number of topics we're going to get, and the more those topics are going to concentrate on the courses are going to concentrate on drug therapy to the exclusion of other things that doctors should be learning about. So again, ignore the fact that the content is biased. Just the range of things that you're going to be educated about is much narrower if you're using the drug companies for your money. And once again, here is an example of doctors' naivety. This comes from Scotland this time, where they ask GPs and consultants, in other words, specialists, their attitudes about continuing education sponsored by drug companies. So 42% of the GPs and almost a similar number of consultants recognized that sponsored CME creates a conflict of interest. So they weren't naive, or at least 40% weren't naive about that. But if you ask them whether or not their personal prescribing will be influenced, the numbers are significantly lower. So again, doctors fail to recognize how much they can be influenced. Here in Canada, the past few years, Pfizer, largest drug company in the world, entered into an agreement with the Canadian Medical Association to provide almost $800,000 to fund continuing education that the Canadian Medical Association will develop. The content of this CME is going to be decided by this administrative board, which will have 2 reps from the Pfizer, 2 reps from the CMA, and 2 reps from outside organizations that aren't specified. And the director of knowledge transfer for the CME said there's no connection between the funder and the people who are actually providing the content. Well, I would put that on the level of believing in Santa Claus. I think that's, again, being particularly naive. If you're going to, there's a quote or a story about Shaw that I have heard. Shaw went up to a woman and said, will you sleep with me for $1? And the woman said, no. Oh, sorry. He asked, will you sleep with me for $1 million? And the woman said, well, I'd certainly think about it. And then Shaw said, would you sleep with me for $1? And the woman said, definitely not. What do you think I am? And Shaw's response was, madam, we've already established what you are. Now we're haggling over the price. I think that, you know, the CMA is being a whore. It's just the price that's the question. All right. So, clinical practice guidelines. The amount of medical information that's out there is really overwhelming. And there's no way that any single doctor, even in one area of practice, could keep up with the amount of information that's there. So the response has been to develop these things called clinical practice guidelines, where what you do is you get a group of experts, often both what are content experts and methodology experts. In other words, people who understand how information is developed. You get them to go through the literature, evaluate it, and come up with recommendations for how a particular condition should be treated, or, well, sometimes not just treated, investigated, recognized, and treated. And these things get published as guidelines for doctors so that you can, it's a quick way of knowing what's out there and what is the most appropriate way in general for dealing with a problem. And there are lots of guidelines. The Canadian Medical Association lists over 1,000 guidelines that have been developed by one or more organizations in Canada over the past number of 10 or so years. Lots of guidelines out there. So what is the quality, or what happens to these guidelines? What's the relationship? The guidelines, to be clear, require money to be developed. Okay, so somebody has to pay the cost of searching the literature. Somebody has to pay for people to get together at a meeting, to go over the literature, evaluate it. Somebody has to pay for the cost of actually producing the guidelines in physical form or more likely nowadays in electronic form, but either way. So guidelines cost money. So who has the money? Well, the drug companies do. And the people who develop the guidelines often have relationships with the industry. So here we have an example of that. This is the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is the Bible of the psychiatric profession in North America and increasingly around the world. This is for DSM-4, which has now been superseded by DSM-5. DSM-4 had 18 different working groups developing guidelines for different areas in psychiatry. And what this measures here is what percentage of the people on these 18 different committees had a relationship with the drug industry. So you can see here for committee number 7 and committee number 12, 100% of people had a relationship with the industry. There was only one committee, I don't know what they were working on, number 18, that had 0 members with a relationship with the industry, and a lot of them, more than half of the membership. There's now some the woman who did this, the paper where this appeared, is now working on looking at the quality of the information in DSM-5 to see whether or not the conflict of interest in the creating of DSM-5 actually influenced the content of what it says. Some preliminary work that she's put out says that it did influence it in favor of the industry. Okay, we don't, again, Canada, we haven't collected as much information, but there has been a little bit. So this looks at guidelines developed by 3 different Canadian groups. So the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Health Care, the Canadian Diabetes Association, and the Canadian Cardiovascular Society. And these were guidelines for how doctors should treat diabetes and high cholesterol. And if you go down over here, this is the column that matters. So for the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Health Care, only 3 of the 15 panel members had a conflict. But when you're at the Canadian Diabetes Association, you're at 78%. And when you're at the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, it's 100% of the members on the committee had a conflict. Now again, does the conflict lead to a bias in the information? And the answer is that we don't know for sure. But there's other evidence out there that clearly shows that conflicts, at least when it comes to publications, that the more conflicted doctors are, the more their recommendations when they're writing journal articles benefits the industry. So.
Right. Conflict of interest or conflict in sense of disagreement?
No, conflict of interest with the industry. In other words, do you have a relationship with one or more of the companies whose drugs are being recommended in your guidelines? So a relationship could be you've taken research money from them, you sit on one of their advisory committees, your drug companies have speakers bureaus, doctors who go around and speak on behalf of products made by the company. So are you doing that? Do you have shares in the company. Those are financial conflicts of interest that have been investigated. And when you look at journal articles or research articles that are published, and you look at what do the articles say, are their conclusions favorable to the industry, the more conflicted doctors are, the more likely it is that the conclusions of the research is going to favor the industry. So the implication, although not proven, is that the same thing will hold true with conflict of interest guidelines. The more conflicted you are, the more people who have conflicts, the more the guidelines are going to favor interests of the industry. In other words, recommend particular drugs that are made by the companies, or recommend drugs when other forms of treatment are more acceptable. Okay. One particular example of conflict of interest is around a product called Zigris, made by Eli Lilly. Zigris has now been pulled from the market because it eventually was found that it didn't work. But that took a number of years. So Zigris was used for treating something called septic shock. So septic shock is shock. Shock basically means somebody who's very sick. Septic is from infection. So people who have one form of infection or another and are critically ill, requiring often being put on drugs to raise their blood pressure, being intubated, in other words, having breathing done for them by machines, and a variety of other things. And that's what Zigris was supposed to help with the treatment of. And Lilly was hoping that Zigris would be a blockbuster drug. Blockbuster drugs are defined as drugs that sell more than $1 billion worldwide per year. So this is when Zigris comes on the market in the US, middle of 2001. It doesn't do badly, but it's not really as much as Lilly was looking for. So Lilly starts this thing called Surviving Sepsis campaign. This is a campaign around the treatment of sepsis, which talks also not just about Zigris, but looks at Zigris as one component of treating sepsis. And this campaign was clearly designed to increase sales, which it did moderately well at. In order to run the Surviving Sepsis campaign, Lilly hires this PR company. And part of the Surviving Sepsis campaign is the idea that doctors are not using Zigris because it's really expensive. And so the message is, don't be afraid of spending lots of money on this drug because it's going to help save your patients. So go ahead and, do it. Don't put money ahead of people's lives. And Lilly provided a group of doctors and bioethicists, because this aspect of putting money ahead of treatment was deemed as an ethical issue, so they used bioethicists in addition to doctors. They got a grant to address ethical issues raised by rationing, in other words, not using enough Zigris in the intensive care unit setting. Lilly provided 90% of the funding for this. campaign, including publication of guidelines around sepsis management. It turns out that the guidelines gave the highest grade of rating to therapies that were the subject of randomized controlled trials, which is reasonable because randomized controlled trials are the highest level of evidence in medicine. And because Zigris had been studied in randomized controlled trials, it got a very favorable rating. Whereas things which had been used for a long time, antibiotics, giving lots of fluids, vasopressors, that's drugs to increase blood pressure, got lower ratings because they'd been around for so long that nobody had done randomized controlled trials on them. So this guideline was designed to make sure that Zigris was highly recommended, more so than things which were well established for treating sepsis. Prowess showed an increased risk of serious bleeding with Zigris. 2 other studies were terminated early because they were unlikely to show benefit, and they confirmed a bleeding risk. The guidelines did not mention one of the studies, left out. Another study, again, looked at bleeding risk. The guidelines included some information from this, but did not talk about the increased risk of bleeding. And the guidelines also failed to note that the most influential organization dealing with infectious diseases in the US, the Infectious Disease Society of America, did not endorse the guidelines. So all of this, one more. Oh, no, sorry. All of this just shows that these guidelines, which were nominally supposed to be independent, but were heavily financed by Lilly, had significant biases associated with them. Okay. Coming back to Canada, this was a paper that recently came out last summer, which looked at conflict of interest in Canadian medical schools. So all 17 Canadian medical schools were evaluated on these 12 different criteria. How well did they regulate these different things? So ghostwriting means companies hire medical education companies to write the article, and then they go around and find some academic who's willing to sign their name to the article that they didn't write. Disclosure of conflicts of interest, acceptance of gifts, taking scholarships offered by drug companies, faculty consulting for drug companies, allowing drug companies to put on educational events at the medical school, paying doctors on faculty for various things, giving them honoraria. Did the curriculum in the medical school talk about conflict of interest issues? Were faculty allowed to speak on behalf of the drug companies? Did the medical schools allow sales reps to come into the medical school? And finally, what did they have to say about samples? So we rated all of these schools, their policies, on a scale of 0 to 2. 0 meant either no policy or a very permissive policy. 1 was somewhat restrictive, and 2 was very restrictive. And here we have the scores. So remember, this is a score out of maximum of 2. What's the average score? Well, the average score for any of these items never even got to 1. So that meant, on average, these schools, for each of these 12 items, had either no policy and or a very permissive policy, or the policy was only moderately restrictive. In other words, Canadian medical schools are not doing a very good job at regulating conflict of interest issues within the school themselves. These policies were as of September 2011. We're going to update this study probably later in the spring. This is a slightly older study. This looked at what we termed Canadian Academic Health Science Centers. So this was either medical schools in Canada or the teaching hospitals associated with the medical schools. And we wanted to know, again, about conflict of interest guidelines within these academic health science centers. And we looked at things like definition. Did they have policies with definitions and examples? What did they define the interests that should be disclosed? How are these conflicts of interest managed? Did they give you details about publicly available details about disclosure? And what did they say about publication rights? In other words, did they require, if a doctor signed a contract to do research on behalf of a drug company, did the contract have to say that the doctors were the ones who who had the decision about whether the research results should be funded, should be published, or was that a decision of the drug companies? And again, so there were a total of 74 different items. This just gives some of them. And what percentage of the academic medical centers covered each item? And you can see there that aside from definition of conflict of interest provided, regular review of conflict of interest, and sanctions for failure to comply, the majority of these academic health science centers didn't cover these items. So medical schools don't do a very good job. Neither do the teaching hospitals that are associated with them. So just saying that very few of these, that most of the time the items were not covered. So finally, I want to go to the issue of, do doctors recognize the problems associated with engaging with the drug companies? So this is a somewhat old study, but still widely quoted, done in the Boston area. Boston, because of the how easily available independent sources of knowledge were between medical libraries, medical schools, large hospitals. And so they asked a group of doctors, where do you go for information about drugs, about medical therapy? And they gave them the choice of 3 different things: sales reps, ads in medical journals, or scientific papers. And the doctors were pretty negative about sales reps, about even more negative about drug ads, and pretty positive about scientific papers as being the source that they would go to for information. But then what they did was they asked the doctors, same group of doctors, their attitudes about two different groups of drugs. And one was something called cerebral vasodilators. So about 40, 50 years ago, one of the theories around dementia was that dementia was caused by a lack of blood going to the brain, and that if you could dilate up the blood vessels, the arteries supplying the brain, you would help to relieve some of the symptoms of dementia. And so the drug companies came out with a group of drugs called cerebral vasodilators. Now, by the time that Avorn did his paper in '82, the idea that cerebral vasodilators had any effect was regarded as junk science in the medical literature, but not, in fact, in the ads from the drug companies, and not from the information that the sales reps were giving out. So you had two different views of the value of these drugs, one from the scientific literature, where the doctors said that they were going for their information, and one view, a different view, from the drug company sources of information. So what did this same group of doctors have to say about this class of drugs? And similarly, we had the other class was the propoxyphene group of analgesics, painkillers, best represented by something called dextropropoxyphene, at that point promoted as a painkiller for moderate to severe pain, but in fact, when objectively evaluated, not very effective at all, but with a both addictive potential and with a potential to cause liver damage. So medical literature in this case was saying not very good and significant safety problems. The commercial literature was saying good for moderate to severe pain. So here we have the results. So 71% of these doctors said impaired cerebral blood flow was a major cause of senile dementia. That is a view that was only coming from the drug companies at that point, from their ads and their sales reps. And a third of the doctors said that cerebral vasodilators were useful in managing confused geriatric patients. Again, a view which was only found in the commercial publications. As far as Darvon or dextropropoxyphene goes, the majority, 80% of doctors thought that it was as good or better than aspirin. Again, something that was only in the commercial literature. So despite the fact that these doctors said that they much preferred scientific papers over commercial literature, their attitudes about these two particular groups of drugs said that they were being influenced. And presumably they had no idea that they were being influenced. This paper was, or type of study, was subsequently duplicated in the UK as part of somebody's PhD thesis. So the doctors there were asked about information on current drugs and information on new drugs, and they ranked a variety of sources in terms of where they thought they would go. So the BNF is the British National Formulary, widely regarded as a very authoritative piece of information. MIMS is a commercial publication listing drugs and some information about them. Here in Canada, the equivalent is the CPS, so when you go to your doctor, you may see the doctor has this big, thick blue book. Again, lists information. This is government-approved information about the drugs. DTB, Drugs and Therapeutic Bulletin. The equivalent in North America is something called the medical letter. This is put out by independent groups that evaluate drugs, also very authoritative. And then the others are pretty self-explanatory. So you can see here that the information from drug companies out of the 16 various sources got ranked pretty low. Nobody was very interested in getting their information from those sources. But again, if you ask these doctors about particular drugs, then for 2 out of the 4 drugs, and I don't know what the drugs were, they didn't say, but the majority of doctors had attitudes about them that were found in the commercial literature rather than what was found in the scientific literature. So again, doctors are being influenced and they're unaware of their influence. So, what does this mean? Well, this simply means it takes 2 to tango. So the drug companies could spend billions and billions of dollars on promoting to doctors, but if doctors weren't willing to dance with the industry, the money would have no effect. The money seems to have lots of effect. So you can't blame just the drug companies. The doctors need to share the blame equally for what happens. So in conclusion, doctors and drug companies are always going to interact at some level. But the interests of drug companies and doctors are not always compatible. Doctors don't realize that they're being influenced by the drug companies. And in this case, ignorance is not bliss. The drug companies are doing what's best for them. And it's up to the medical profession to do what's best for our patients. And in my view, that is avoiding the drug companies as much as possible. That's it. um, have much more resources than anybody else. And the more they spend, the more that what they do and the interactions that doctors have with them is regarded as the norm, and both by government and also by the medical profession. The medical profession is probably the only one that I know that thinks that somebody else should pay for its continuing education, despite the fact that the amount of money that doctors have. So you, at one point, I think it was the American Psychiatric Association, they were talking about reducing how much money they get from companies for their annual meetings, and somebody was saying that if they didn't take the money from the drug companies, that they would be holding their meetings in high school cafeterias. And the point is, so what? I mean, do you need to bribe doctors by holding the meetings in 5-star hotels? And if you do, what does that say about the doctors? But so there's not in terms of money, and also in terms of influence, more in the U.S. than here. But in the U.S., for instance, there are more lobbyists for the drug companies than there are members of Congress. And the industry, I think, is number 1 or number 2 in terms of the amount of money it gives to the politicians for re-election, which buys a lot of influence. And then you get the crossovers. So people who in the U.S. have headed up the Food and Drug Administration go on to work for the drug companies. The next to last chair of the Industry Association in the U.S. had been a member of Congress. So you get, industry is able to exercise its influence in a number of ways, and the more the industry contributes to a country's economy, the more influence it has. So in the UK, for instance, the industry, I think, is the second largest source of export dollars after munitions.
Just a final comment. James Brown.
Yeah.
Met his lecture series recently and spoke about various ways in which you could cut the incentives. James Brown.
Yeah.
And so his talk was about patents and how we should remove patents from our drug system, or various other curtails on the drug industry influence, like having government-controlled random trials
Yep.
for drugs and such. So
I mean, these are, again, the patent system has a very perverse influence on what drugs get developed and how they're promoted. So drug companies only look at products that can be patented because that's how they make their money. Patents give them, well, under the TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, you have 20 years of patent protection from the time that you file for a patent, which means that it takes about 8 years between filing and getting a product on the market. So you have 12 years of monopoly rights to that product. So in that 12 years, you're going to promote the hell out of your drug to get as much money as you can, because once it becomes genericized, you don't sell very much at all. So patents create a variety of negative incentives. But on the other hand, although people are talking about different ways of dealing with it. So there are ideas around prize funds for drugs, so that companies, rather than taking out a patent, would get, depending on how valuable the drug is, would get a certain amount of money out of this prize fund. There are other things talking about what's called an R&D treaty, so that the major countries around the world would put in a certain amount of money, which would be used to do research into drugs. There are a whole bunch of things that have been talked about, but nothing's gotten further than the talking stage. Again, because the countries that have the ability to make a difference are also the ones that are doing quite well under the current system in terms of economics.
This is wonderful, and can I suggest that you come and sit down here, and let's continue one little thing, which is where to go from here in
All right.
terms of your research and how to connect with it in a way that actually deals with some of the issues. Now, Peter Russell and I originally formed a working